I think we want to keep on time. So it's 6:04. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Lisa Richardson. I'm the Associate Dean of Inclusion and Diversity at the Temerity Faculty of Medicine. And this is a very special night. It's a snowy night here in Toronto. I think it may even be stormy a little bit where Professor Irwin Cotler is, but he'll fill us in on that in a moment. And I want to welcome you all to Diversity Dialogues. This is, we in the Office of Inclusion and Diversity profile topics and speakers to educate our community and to support our community within Temerity Faculty of Medicine about issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and indigeneity. And one of the things that we're very committed to in our office is the inclusion of work related to anti-Semitism and religious-based discrimination in all that we do, and to recognize how integral that is to our work in EDI. And so it is with pleasure that we are hosting this event. And I want to acknowledge that we are hosting this event on the eve of International Holocaust Memorial Day. I recognize that this is a very important day, but that the experiences of anti-Semitism are ones that our friends in the Jewish community and those of you in the Jewish community live with every day. Not only the experiences of your ancestors, but the concerns that you have about the experiences of your children and grandchildren and the generations that will come after you. And we are committed in the Faculty of Medicine to creating inclusive environments where all people will thrive and where nobody experiences discrimination based on their background, religion, race, or ethnicity. So in that spirit, I want to actually begin with a quote that I came upon last night as I was thinking about opening words for this. And it's in the spirit of relatedness and in the spirit of my own background as an Anishinaabe person to think about our connectedness as humans. And it's from Richard Wagamese, who's an Anishinaabe writer who passed away several years ago. I've been considering the phrase all my relations for some time now. It's hugely important. It's our saving grace in the end. It points to the truth that we are related, that we are all connected, that we all belong to each other. With those words, I'm going to welcome Ayelet Cooper, who is the Strategic Advisor in Anti-Semitism for the Temerity Faculty of Medicine, to do a land acknowledgement and then introduce Dr. Patricia Houston.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. As you say, I'd like to begin this evening with an acknowledgement of the land on which we work, study, and live. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the work of the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine is conducted that long precede the establishment of the University of Toronto and the Toronto Academic Health Sciences Network. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on these territories. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Given that this is a virtual gathering, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture the richness of our distribution across many locations. There are a few places on earth that someone before us has not called home. I encourage you to consider your own position with regard to the land where you find yourself. If you are not sure how to locate the Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages that shape both the past and the present of your current location, I invite you to take a moment now to look it up. In your browser, you can type in nativeland.ca for a crowdsourced interactive map built around principles of land as pedagogy. If you have an iPhone, you can download an app called Whose Land? That will provide you with similar information. You may also want to learn more about Indigenous history and culture, and I encourage you to consider doing so through courses like the Sanyas online training program, which provides CME credits, or the free Indigenous Canada online course run by the University of Alberta. The intention is to use these resources as an opportunity to critically engage in discussions about colonization, land rights, language, and Indigenous history. Land acknowledgements are only a starting point for larger conversations. More concrete acts of restitution and transformation are needed to address underlying inequities and blatant discrimination in the distribution of resources between this land's first people and its settlers. I'd like now to call on Professor Patricia Houston, who is the Vice Dean Education and Acting Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, who will introduce Professor Cotler. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have the pleasure tonight of introducing the Honorable Irwin Cotler, who's going to speak at tonight's Diversity Dialogue. I'm very glad that he's agreed to share his reflections on this, the eve of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On January 27th, 1945, the Nazi concentration camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated. We remember the over 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, along with the Romani, the LGBTQ2S individuals, the persons with disabilities, and the political dissidents who were murdered during the Holocaust. Tonight's event is presented by Temerity Medicine's Office of Inclusion and Diversity in partnership with the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies and the Roel Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. I want to extend my sincere thanks to everyone who's contributed to making this event possible, especially to Professor Cotler. For those of you who are not familiar with Professor Cotler's considerable contributions to Canada and to the international community, please allow me to provide you with a very brief introduction. He's the International Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, an Emeritus Professor of Law at McGill, a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, a former Member of Parliament, and an international human rights lawyer. A constitutional and comparative law scholar, Professor Cotler has published extensively in the field of human rights law, and he has intervened in landmark legal cases in the areas of free speech, freedom of religion, minority rights, peace law, and war crimes justice. On November 25th, 2020, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau named Professor Cotler the Special Envoy in preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. In this role, Professor Cotler works with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Youth, and other ministers to inform the Government of Canada policy and programming to reinforce and strengthen Canada's efforts to advance Holocaust education, remembrance, and research, and to combat anti-Semitism as key elements of the promotion and protection of human rights at home and abroad. He has received many honorary doctorates. He is a scholar and an advocate of international stature. He's an officer of the Order of Canada, an officer of the National Order of Quebec, and a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. So without further ado, I would like you to now invite Professor Cotler to our virtual podium to deliver his remarks and to share with us some of his wisdom and insight. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, Professor Cotler.
And thank you, Professor Houston, for really those very kind words of introduction. And I want to thank you and the Temerity Faculty of Medicine, the faculty, the students, the staff, and all those associated with organizing this timely and significant gathering. For as you mentioned, we meet at an important moment of remembrance and reminder. For we meet on the eve of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, marking the 77th anniversary of the liberation of the death camp Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, a mass laboratory, a laboratory for mass murder for which there are no graves. 1.3 million people were deported to the death camp Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism itself did not die at Auschwitz, and it remains the bloody canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. Indeed, we are witnessing, as we meet, an old, new, escalating, intensifying, global, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism, grounded in classical anti-Semitism, but distinguishable from it, that first received international, institutional, and juridical expression in the United Nations Zionism is Racism Resolution of 1975, but has gone dramatically even beyond that. An old, new anti-Semitism for which we almost need a new vocabulary to define it, but which can perhaps best be defined, as my colleague Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Rapporteur of Freedom, Religion, and Belief, put it in his landmark report to the UN 2 years ago, which can best be defined using a human rights lens, or more particularly, an equality rights lens. In other words, traditional or classical anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the right of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism is discrimination. All that has happened is that we have moved from discrimination against Jews as individuals to discrimination against Jews as a people, and reverberating back to discrimination against Jews as individuals. Indeed, this equality rights lens, this human rights lens itself, is a looking glass, the beginning of a looking glass into anti-Semitism as the oldest, longest, most enduring, and most dangerous of hatreds. One, if I may use a medical metaphor, which is so common now with regard to a pandemic of COVID, one which mutates and metastasizes over time, but is grounded in one historical anti-Semitic trope, and that is the Jews as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil, and that finds expression across the centuries in terms of whatever is the zeitgeist, the canon at any particular moment in time. And so when Christianity was the dominant religious ethos, the Jews were accused of deicide, of being the murderers of Christ. When in the Middle Ages we had the Black Plagues, then the Jews were accused of being the embodiment of all evil, of being the poisoners of the international wells. When it came to the more contemporary times now, and I'm speaking from, let's say, the last 50 years, when human rights emerged as the new secular religion of our time, something that excited me as a law professor in the 70s, then we found that Jews, the Jewish people, Israel, were being singled out as the new meta human rights violator of our times, as being, in a word, the new Antichrist of our times. Let me give you an example from the year before that the Zionism as Racism Resolution was passed at the UN, 1974, a snapshot of what occurred in 1974. And so it was then that Israel was accused of being the enemy of labor. Evidence, the resolution of the International Labor Organization condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian trade unionism. I can use the word alleged, but this was the reality of the resolutions as adopted. The enemy of health. Evidence, the resolution of the World Health Organization condemning Israeli poisonings of Palestinians in the West Bank. In fact, a year ago, Israel was held to be not only a violator of health rights, but the only violator of health rights in the world today. The enemy of culture. Evidence, the resolution of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of historic sites in the West Bank and Jerusalem. The enemy of women. Evidence, the resolution of the UN Commission on Women's Rights condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian women's rights. And here, may I add again that last year, Israel was held out to be the only violator of women's rights in the world. The enemy of peace. Evidence, the resolution of the UN General Assembly condemning Israel as a non-peace loving nation. And finally, the enemy of human rights in the resolutions of the Human Rights Council, among others, UN Human Rights Council, condemning Israel for its oppression of Palestinian rights. And so it is that Israel, being held out as the enemy of labor, health, culture, women, peace, human rights, Israel, as the enemy of all that was good, was being held out to be the embodiment of all that is evil. None of this is intended to suggest that Israel is somehow above the law, or that the Jewish people deserve any particular privilege or preference because of the Holocaust or the horrors of Jewish history. Not at all. Israel, like any other state, like any other democratic state, is responsible for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law, and to be held accountable like any other state. But that is the point. Like any other state. The problem is not that Israel should seek, or that anyone should seek on its behalf, that Israel be above the law, but that Israel is being systematically denied equality before the law. Not that Israel should respect human rights, which she must, but that the rights of Israel deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards are applied to Israel, which they must be, but that these human rights standards must be applied equally to everyone else. This laundering of anti-Semitism under what I would call the protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, the struggle against racism, as we have begun to see, has effectively continued for the last 50 years, has continued indulgently, inexorably, and almost imperceptibly. And it is something that can have a prejudicial impact, particularly a prejudicial impact on a country like Canada. And I say this because in Canada, we see, and rightly so, the United Nations as being part of our DNA. We hold out, even though we don't always ourselves adhere to this, of international law as being a centerpiece of our identity, and rightly so, and of human rights as being an organizing idiom of our foreign policy. I experienced this laundering phenomenon when I served as a member of the Canadian delegation to human rights during my days as a law professor. And I witnessed then this drumbeat of indictment, as I've been describing, trot itself out at the UN. And let me give you just one of many examples. That is, every year, annually, at the UN, in decisions at the UN General Assembly, Israel is singled out for condemnation in some 17 to 20 resolutions, while there are some 5 to 6 resolutions against the rest of the world combined, while the major human rights violators enjoy exculpatory immunity, where there are no resolutions adopted, for example, against China or Russia, amongst those who are mounting, even as we meet, an assault on the rules-based international legal order. Now, one has to understand that these delegations at the UN, such as the one that I was a member of, the Canadian delegation, include not only diplomats, they include academics, they include civil servants, journalists, and the like. And most come to the UN and are members of delegations who are rather uninformed about the Middle East. They come, if you will, as a tabula rasa, not particularly informed. This is not something to be held against them. Many of us would not be particularly informed about issues which we had not been, particularly engaged in. But what happens is that they are exposed to this drumbeat of indictment over a 3-month period, because the resolutions are proposed in September. They are processed through committee deliberations. They're then adopted in December. And so each of the members of each of the country delegations at the UN are exposed to this incessant drumbeat of indictment, as I mentioned, and then willy-nilly internalize the very nature of these indictments. And that can have a prejudicial impact on our thinking, particularly, as I say, with Canadians, where, and I say this in a good sense, the UN is part of our DNA. Let me now just turn to the 21st century and to two tipping points in this old, new anti-Semitism. The first was the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in September 2001. I must admit that as a law professor in 1997, when it was first announced that there was to be a World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, I greeted this with anticipation, if not excitement. This was going to be the first anti-racism conference of the 21st century, at a time that anti-racism, rightly so, was emerging as a compelling challenge. This was to be the first international human rights conference of the 21st century, where the promotion and protection of human rights was to be an organizing theme, something that I greatly welcomed as one who was, in fact, teaching human rights and involved in human rights advocacy at the time. And the conference was to take place in Durban, South Africa, and to commemorate the dismantling of apartheid, something I also welcomed as one who had been involved in the struggle against apartheid. Indeed, we are meeting now on the 40th anniversary of my having been first arrested in South Africa during my visit there, advocating against apartheid South Africa. But what happened at Durban, if I can use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A world conference against racism and hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against Israel and the Jewish people. A world conference for the promotion and protection of human rights turned into a conference singling out one member state, Israel, and one people, the Jews, for selective opprobrium and indictment. A conference that was to commemorate the dismantling of South African apartheid, which, as I said, I welcomed so happily, turned into a conference calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. As one who, at that point, having become a parliamentarian, was a member of the Canadian delegation to Durban and also participated in the NGO forum at Durban, I have to say that what happened at Durban has been indelibly imprinted, not only on my memory, but on my being. I can still see the images. I can still hear the chanting of thousands of demonstrators in the streets saying, that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. I can still see the posters and the placards comparing Jews to the Nazis, saying, too bad Hitler didn't finish the job. Posters and placards that I still have in my possession. I can still see the pamphlets of the protocols of the elders of Zion, that anti-Semitic forgery distributed at Durban. I can still see the caricatures of Jews with hooked noses, hands drenched in blood, clutching dollar bills and the like, the classic anti-Semitic stereotypes. And all of this in the NGO forum, which culminated these images that I'm sharing with you, seeing Jewish students being assaulted and being told, you don't belong to the human race. As I say, these are chants, these are images, these are placards, these are posters from this festival of hate that have indelibly imprinted themselves on my memory and being. I flew back from South Africa to Montreal on September 10th. I awoke in the morning of September 11th to 9/11. And I still recall a colleague of mine speaking to me on 9/11 later that day from South Africa and saying to me in words that I still recall and share with you, saying, if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, Durban was the Mein Kampf. This from a person who had witnessed the previous 2 weeks that we had been in Durban. Durban then became, in effect, the launching pad for the old new anti-Semitism, which has been mutating and metastasizing these past 20 years, laundering itself, as I mentioned, under the protective cover of human rights and anti-racism. Indeed, in the immediate aftermath of Durban, Jews and Israel were in fact blamed for 9/11. A meeting of the UN Commission of Human Rights, as it was called at the time, now the UN Council on Human Rights, singled out Israel and Israel alone for a series of condemnatory resolutions, where, as I said, the major human rights violators enjoyed exculpatory immunity. A meeting at the University of Michigan turned into a launching pad for the call for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. Indeed, what happened at the University of Michigan was itself revealing. A resolution supporting two states for two peoples, something that I have been a long time supporter of, was defeated, or I should put it this way, supporting two states for two peoples if Israel were to become a democratic state, itself problematic, was defeated and replaced by a resolution calling openly for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And so the launching then of this clarion call for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And as I wrote at the time, that one of the worst things one can say about anyone, a person, a people, a country, is to call them racist. The very label supplies the indictment. Almost nothing further is ever required or sometimes even allowed. But what happened here was not only referring to Israel as racist, but referring to it as an apartheid state. And apartheid, as I wrote then at the time, apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. And so if you say that Israel is an apartheid state, you are saying that Israel is a crime against humanity. If it is a crime against humanity, then it has no right to be. And if that is not enough, then you call it also a Nazi state. So not only does it have no right to be, but in fact, we have an obligation to see that it has no right to be. Something, as I said, that I wrote about in the immediate aftermath of 2001, over 20 years ago now. And then came the final and most disturbing immediate post-Durban followed. And this was the meeting, the first ever meeting of the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, the corpus of international humanitarian law. And these contracting parties to the Geneva Convention met for the first time in 52 years, because the convention had been adopted in 19, met for the first time now in 2001 in the aftermath of Durban. And the first state ever condemned for violations of international humanitarian law, 52 years after the adoption of the Geneva Convention, was not Iran, was not Russia, was not China, was not any of the countries themselves engaged in human rights violations at the time. The first and only country ever to be condemned by the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention was Israel, because it was condemned twice thereafter, marking 3 times that the contracting parties of the Geneva Convention came together to put one state and condemn it in the docket of the accused. What I wanted to add about this is that Durban not only became a launching pad for all the assaults that I mentioned, but it also became a launching pad not only for the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of human rights, but for effectively becoming an assault on human rights themselves. Let me give you some examples. I've written extensively about this. I've written about 12 examples of the post-Durban assault on human rights. But let me share briefly, some 4 or 5 of these examples. The first is the phenomenon of what I would call genocidal anti-Semitism, and did so at the time. By genocidal anti-Semitism, I'm referring to the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most virulent of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, and finding expression in the public call for the destruction of Israel and the Jewish people. Indeed, in the early days of 2000, as we began the 21st century, it may be forgotten, or perhaps it was never even known, that the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, the leader of Iran, stated as follows, that there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish people. He did not even use the euphemism Zionist, and an incitement to genocide that has been repeated many times since, regrettably, with inaction by the international community. I say this because the Genocide Convention prohibits not only acts of genocide, it prohibits incitement to genocide. And the Supreme Court of Canada, in the Mugesera case, in a landmark judgment, said that the very incitement to genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide follow. Yet, for the last 20 years, the international community has yet to hold Khamenei's Iran, and I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in Iran who are otherwise themselves the targets of mass oppression, have yet to hold Khamenei's Iran accountable for its standing violation of incitement to genocide under the Genocide Convention. This is not a policy option for the international community. This is an international legal responsibility. Second was the phenomenon of political anti-Semitism. By political anti-Semitism, I'm referring to the denial of Israel's legitimacy, if not its existence as a state, or the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, or the denial even that there is a Jewish people. Something which Martin Luther King, when he spoke that the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, as would be the denial of the right to self-determination of the African people or any other people, that the denial to the Jewish people of its right to self-determination, as Martin Luther King had put it, was in fact anti-Semitism. The third was what I would call ideological anti-Semitism. Ideological anti-Semitism refers to the singling out of Israel as an imperialist, colonialist, racist, ethnic cleansing, child murdering, apartheid, Nazi state. All the indictments which effectively underpin the notion of Israel and the Jewish people as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil. A more apt term might be here even demonological anti-Semitism, when one takes all these ideological indictments, not only singly, but collectively. A fourth is the increasing proliferation, not only of Holocaust denial, because that has in fact been superseded by Holocaust distortion, where, and for medical community, where the pandemic, COVID-19, has been weaponized to single out Jews, the Jewish people, and Israel for manufacturing the COVID virus, for causing its spread, and profiting from it. Again, the classic trope in contemporary terms, the Jew as the poisoner of the wells. And so you see how these various outcomes of Durban that were present before mutated and metastasized even more, leading to the final example that I will give of assault on human rights, and that is terrorist anti-Semitism, which found expression recently in the hostage taking in a Texas synagogue, a synagogue which was targeted on the Sabbath, where the rabbi and the congregants were taken hostage, where they were threatened by a UK Islamist who had traveled to North America to target this synagogue and threatened to kill the hostages unless they used their quote unquote power to bring about yet another anti-Semitic trope, to bring about the release of an imprisoned jihadist serving over 80 years in a US prison who had herself engaged in anti-Semitic tropes. And what was disturbing about all this was not only this anti-Jewish terrorist attack, but where it was initially dismissed by FBI and the media, the FBI later recanting, as a random attack, as if this could have been a bank or a shopping mall, when it was a synagogue on a Sabbath and Jews taken as hostages, etc. and being characterized as having nothing to do with the Jewish community. The FBI has since recanted this, has called it an anti-Semitic terror act, as has the US administration, and now this anti-Semitic hate-motivated crime is under further investigation. But all these phenomena are all post-Durban phenomenons of assault on human rights in the form of genocidal anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, ideological anti-Semitism, Holocaust distortion, and terrorist anti-Semitism. Which brings me at this point to what I would call the second tipping point. If Durban was the first tipping point of the 21st century with respect to the mutating and metastasizing of anti-Semitism, I would say mostly intensifying of anti-Semitism, then the Hamas war against Israel in May 2021 became the second tipping point, where, for example, Jews in Canada were threatened and targeted in their homes and in their neighborhoods, in their streets, and in the communities, where synagogues were torched, Holocaust memorials defaced, cemeteries desecrated, Jewish institutions vandalized. The whole leading to the highest incidence of hate crimes, anti-Semitic hate crimes against Jews in our history. What's interesting is that from 2016 to 2020, we had increasingly higher levels of anti-Semitic hate crimes, where Jews, composing some 1% of the population, were the target of 20% of the hate crimes. By May 2021, we had reached the level, after 6 months, of the highest level ever of 2020. And this was matched by an incendiary explosion in hate crimes on the internet, where the social media was replete with anti-Semitic incitement, where in 1 week alone in May 2021, there were 17,000 tweets to the effect that Hitler was right. That in a report released just a day ago, there's been some 4 million anti-Semitic tweets in 2021 alone. And that's just with respect to Twitter. I haven't gone on to the other social media platforms. One of them, for example, being TikTok, which has 1.2 billion users, which in fact has an audience that is largely in the ages, let's say from 15 to 25, saw an exponential 912% rise in 1 year with respect to anti-Semitic hate. And yet, as studies have shown, 84% of such anti-Semitic hate on the social media is not being removed. But I have to tell you that what has concerned me most, as I've been recalling these 2 tipping points now in the 21st century, has been a phenomenon that in my first year as special envoy, I began to not only appreciate, but document. And that is, and I'll just mention some of these dynamics which have emerged from my first year as special envoy. The first thing is, with respect to the work as special envoy, the first thing that I noticed was that the configurative approach to speaking of anti-Semitism as coming from the radical right and the radical left and radical Islam, that tripartite approach is insufficient. I say insufficient because what we are witnessing is the mainstreaming, the normalizing, the legitimation almost of anti-Semitism in the political culture and increasingly in the university culture. Second, what we are witnessing is the globalization of anti-Semitism. By globalization, of anti-Semitism, I'm referring also to the fact that what happens in London, England, and Paris, France, then reverberates in Montreal, Toronto, elsewhere in Canada. In fact, not only reverberates, but replicates itself. So when you had a convoy going through the streets of London in May 2021 saying, F the Jews will rape your daughters, we had a similar convoy replicating this here in Canada. The third dynamic that I have noticed is the marginalizing of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against racism. I say this because it is important that we are all engaged in the struggle against systemic racism against Indigenous peoples. And I'm delighted that Ayala Cooper, in her opening remarks this evening, made reference not only to issues of land, but to the compelling concerns of Indigenous justice. But we have to be involved in issues of racism against Indigenous peoples, Blacks and people of color, Asian Canadians, Muslim Canadians, and in fact, in examining the education and training within and without government, I've noticed a commendable and increasing attention to these necessary anti-racist concerns. But I've also noticed a marginalizing of anti-Semitism in the overall struggle against racism, which is documented in the report I'm presenting to the government in that regard. And finally, and perhaps the most pernicious of all, which I've referenced, and so I'll just mention for a moment, and that is the very laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of anti-racism itself, where, for example, Jewish students in the campus culture are held out to be members of the white, if not supremacist class, and forced to choose between their Jewish identity and acceptance in the progressive campus culture. And I'm pleased that the U of T report with respect to anti-Semitism has appreciated that point. Or similarly, where Israel is held out to be the oppressor country in the Middle East, for which Jewish students have to either distance themselves or apologize for. And so these are the dynamics that I find are of particular concern. And so I was pleased when the Canadian government held its national summit to combat anti-Semitism in July. And this was followed, more importantly, by a series of country pledges at the recent Malmo Conference on Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism, where Canada made a number of specific pledges. And what I will do now in moving to a close is identify these pledges within what I would call a prospective national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, which I first shared at the National Summit to Combat Anti-Semitism, and which has been refined in the light of these country pledges and my experience as special envoy. The first is the importance of Holocaust remembrance and commemoration itself. I mentioned this because I have noted in my first year that this too is a learning experience. And so when we, for example, commemorated the 80th anniversary of the mass murder of Jews in Babi Yar in September 1941, when in 28th and 29th of September, you had 33,750 Jews murdered in 2 days. Then this part of the Holocaust, the parallel Holocaust, sometimes been called the Holocaust by bullets, then became part of increasing public understanding and the lessons to be learned therefrom, just as we commemorated the 83rd anniversary of Kristallnacht of 1938, where what was not appreciated was that Kristallnacht which became the gateway to the Holocaust, did not happen by accident. The first concentration camp was actually established in 1933. The Nuremberg race laws were 1935. The incitement to hatred and anti-Semitism was proceeding apace from 33 and underpinned Kristallnacht and the like. And so therefore, the understanding that anti-Semitism is toxic to democracies. All these we learn from our commemoration of remembrances, as we are doing now with regard to the International Day of Holocaust Remembrance and the marking of the 77th anniversary of Auschwitz, as I mentioned, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century. The second is the importance, and this was a specific country pledge at Malmo, of educating about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism across generational lines. This has become particularly important because of the emergence just in the last few days of astonishing data, where the UN Secretary General Guterres, in a talk just yesterday evening, identified the fact that some 50% of the world's population has never heard of the Holocaust, where studies by Liberation 75 that had just been released yesterday here in Canada speak also about the levels of ignorance. And even prior to this study, we knew that some 50% of millennials can't name one concentration camp, let alone the death camp Auschwitz. And so the importance, therefore, of teaching and educating about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism, of the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil and anti-Semitism as a paradigm for radical hate. The third, combating the increasing Holocaust proliferation, which I've mentioned, where classical anti-Semitic tropes are being instrumentalized for the purposes of both denying, distorting, trivializing, and minimizing the Holocaust. The fourth is the importance of learning of the life and legacy of Raoul Wallenberg. Again, a specific pledge at Malmo of learning about Canada's first honorary citizen who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act and confront evil prevail and transform history. And calling upon Canadian students, for example, on Raoul Wallenberg Commemorative Day, which we just commemorated on January 17th, to learn about and indeed to act upon Raoul Wallenberg's humanitarian legacy at a time that students and young people become sometimes cynical about human rights, about what we can do about injustice. Raoul Wallenberg, a hero of humanity, is an inspiring role model for young people. And so we need to learn and teach about that legacy. The fifth is to enhance both the adoption and the implementation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. A working definition which is the most authoritative, comprehensive, and international consensus definition that we have. And what is not so well known, the most democratic, that it was adopted over a 15-year period. And I say this as one of the people involved originally in the drafting of what became the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, but which was serially adopted by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, in the Interparliamentary Conference about Anti-Semitism in November 2010 in Ottawa. What became the IRA working definition was unanimously adopted by over 50 parliamentarians coming from countries across the globe. So this is, in effect, the most representative of definitions, and it's a non-binding definition. It is there as a resource, as an asset, as an educational tool. In a word, if you can't identify, if you can't recognize anti-Semitism, then you will be hard put to be able to monitor and combat it effectively. The sixth is combating the growth, as I mentioned, in hate crimes. And here around the 4 Ps: prevention, protection of the targets, prosecution of the perpetrators, and partnerships between federal, provincial, municipal law enforcement authorities and civil societies. The 7th would be to combat the incendiary hate on the internet, to hold the social media accountable, because it has become a rules-free universe. If they are not going to be regulating themselves as the gatekeepers of information, then we will have to, in fact, with respect to our responsibility to protect against incitement to hatred, our responsibility under international treaty law to prohibit incitement to discrimination, hostility, and violence, as we are obliged to do in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, then we will have to move for the regulations and accountability of social media ourselves. Number 8, enhanced security for our synagogues and institutions, because what happened in Texas can happen anywhere, as we have learned. Number 9, a zero tolerance policy with respect to anti-Semitism in the political culture, campus culture. In the political culture, for example, we can't have a situation where we call out anti-Semitism in the other's political party, but ignore it in our own. We have to call it out in our own. For example, Republicans can't call it out amongst the Democrats and not call it out amongst themselves, and vice versa. And the same is true here in Canada. Number 10, we have to appreciate that anti-Semitism is toxic to our democracies, that anti-Semitism is a threat to our common humanity. And therefore, we have to understand as well that Jews cannot fight nor combat anti-Semitism alone. What is so necessary now is to have a global constituency of conscience, to have a Canadian constituency of conscience, so that we protect our democracies, so that we protect against this threat to our common humanity. Because as we've learned only too well and too painfully, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And so let us, in the spirit of allyship, work together in common cause to struggle against systemic racism, as I mentioned, of Indigenous peoples, against Blacks and people of color, against Muslims, against Asian Canadians, and yes, against Jews in what is the oldest, most enduring, most virulent, and most lethal of hatreds. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for an incredibly thought-provoking and moving talk. Professor Cotler, you've given us so much to think about, and I'm sure there are many questions that people have. I'm now going to just let people know that we will move into the Q&A period. And so we have approximately just under half an hour for that. And the way the Q&A will work is, because this is a webinar style, you will be entering your questions into the Q&A. And then Dr. Ayala Cooper and I will bring them forward and present them to Professor Cotler. So I'll give you a chance to enter your questions, but we do have some already that are in the chat. And Ayala, do you want to start with sharing some of those questions from the Q&A?
Sure. I'm going to start with really, I think, a question that comes to the heart of the concerns of many of our learners, and it comes from one of our medical learners. I'm not going to name the people who ask questions unless they ask me to, but it comes from someone who I recognize as one of our medical learners. So thank you to our learners for being here. So the question for you, Professor Cotler, is that in the absence of the University of Toronto having chosen or selected a specific definition of anti-Semitism for policy purposes. What are the principles, or how do you suggest people who bring forward complaints about anti-Semitism, how should those complaints be arbitrated? What are the principles in which we should be thinking about when people, and I imagine that the context for this question, to the person who asked this question, feel free to add something in the Q&A if you would like. Whether when people bring forward concerns about anti-Semitism, they are often concerned that they won't be believed, or that their claims that something that they've experienced as anti-Semitic will be put aside, or they will be told that what they've experienced is not anti-Semitism, that they're wrong. And so how can that be arbitrated? Who gets to decide? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, it's quite interesting because I read the report of the University of Toronto's working group on anti-Semitism, and there was a very pertinent reference into the report that the university will take concerns of Jewish students with regard to anti-Semitism seriously, and that they will respect the living experience, testimony of students and how they understand anti-Semitism. That is why I thought that it would be helpful if the university did adopt the working definition of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, because it's based not only on the lived experience over 20 years, of those involved in drafting it, debating it, discussing, implementing it, but it also is both the lived experience of Jewish testimony that was factored into the adoption of that definition, and also of many governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, and scholars. As I said, it was not adopted out of whole cloth. And what is not so well known about the IRA working definition, and as I said, I was a member of the initial drafting group together with the late Nobel Peace Laureate Elie Wiesel, former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, Per Ahlmark, among others, is that we actually utilize the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's why when I said we should be looking at anti-Semitism through an equality rights lens, and I showed how an equality rights lens can be used and applied both with regard to traditional anti-Semitism and new anti-Semitism. Effectively, the IRA working definition is anchored in that human rights lens, in that equality rights lens. And again, it's not binding. It just gives a framework for better understanding and appreciating and being able to recognize anti-Semitism and to better understand the lived experiences of students. And I think the experiences of students have to be taken seriously. I recall, and with this I'll close, a very important moment in the National Summit to combat anti-Semitism. The Prime Minister had given opening words to that summit, but then there was the lived testimony that was shared by a diverse representation from the Jewish community, among others. And the Prime Minister referenced two particular pieces of testimony that were very permanent and impacted on him, and I think on those who were participating. The first was a University of Toronto student, as it happened, who said that he was forced effectively to choose between his Jewish identity and acceptance into the progressive campus culture, where he could be stereotyped as being part of the white privileged class and therefore having to make that kind of choice. Now, this is a painful choice. I think it's recognized in the report that Jewish students should not be put in that position where they are marginalized, maligned, or excluded from the campus culture, but where the IRA working definition, as I say, can provide a better framework for understanding the particular dynamics that may bring this about. The second thing is the testimony of a Black Jewish woman, and who in effect embodied intersectionality as a woman, as a person of color, as a Jew, who testified to the effect that her Jewishness was often singled out even more than being a person of color or being a woman. And so, again, attesting to the singularity in the campus culture, whereby anti-Semitism is being increasingly the lived experience and felt experience of students, and the data that has been coming out in the last few days about the percentage of students who have experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism is astonishing.
Thank you for the answer to that. Professor Cotler, I'm now going to share with you, there are several questions from one of the attendees, and a lot of them relate to the experiences with the United Nations. So I'm going to pick one of them. During your tenure as Minister of Justice for Canada, did Canada abstain or vote against Israel at the UN? And can you speak a little bit more about why Canada was so close to follow the lead of the UN, despite what the anti-Semitic policies that you described?
Well, I think that there was a long period where Canada was not simply attuned to or aware of the extent to which anti-Semitism was being laundered, as I said, under the protective cover of the UN and the Authority of International Law and the like. That began to change during the period of the government of Paul Martin. We were only in government for just a little over 2 years, from December 2003 to beginning of February 2006. And we began the process of changing Canada's votes at the United Nations. This process was continued under the prime ministership of Harper's Conservative government, and maintained under the leadership of the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau. So you now have a situation where, next to the United States, Canada opposes, in effect, some 18 out of 19 of these resolutions condemning Israel at the United Nations, second only to the United States, which has opposed all resolutions, but much better, I might say, than the community of democracies, whether you take the UK, Germany, France, or any of our allies in the G7. Canada's record at this point, I have to say, in that regard, is commendable.
Thank you, Professor Cotler. On a different note, and something that you touched on very briefly in your talk, but that it's been in the news quite a lot lately, a question from one of my clinical colleagues who's been doing a lot of COVID work. We've been hearing a lot from people who are against vaccinations or don't support vaccine mandates, comparing vaccines to the Holocaust, vaccine mandates to the Holocaust, calling the government or healthcare providers Nazis. We saw that in the US with Bobby Kennedy the other day. We've seen it in Canada as well, in terms of people protesting in front of hospitals wearing yellow stars. Can you speak to us a little bit about that, where you see that coming from and how you see all that linking into the times we're in now? Well,
there may be reasons that people, medical reasons for not having a vaccination or medical exemption for that purpose and the like, but engaging in those types of Holocaust distortion and trivialization were really the reasons why I believe, among others, that the United Nations, interestingly enough, talking about important anniversaries, we just had the 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference, which in effect was the conference that addressed in their words, the final solution to the Jewish question, and which was attended by Adolf Eichmann, the desk murderer in the Holocaust. And so that phenomenon of Holocaust distortion and trivialization underpinned the United Nations General Assembly resolution, which has called upon, governments, parliaments, social media, etc., to call out, to condemn, and to address and redress this Holocaust denial and distortion. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has adopted a set of recommendations as to how to both recognize and combat these phenomena of Holocaust distortion, trivialization, minimization, revisionism, inversion, and the like. And some of this, in fact, is part of our jurisprudence of the Supreme Court of Canada. Some of it will now, I suspect, be framed in legislation. The Canadian government has announced that it is going to introduce legislation to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act, to amend the Canadian Criminal Code, so that the rules-free universe regarding social media will now have a measure of accountability when they are not engaged in self-regulating. And I think as citizens, we have to call this out, because this is a painful assault on the memory of Holocaust survivors, on their dignity, on their integrity. And this goes back to the importance of the danger of forgetting and the imperative of remembrance, where if we forget, as Elie Wiesel put it, it is like killing the victims a second time. And when you've got this misappropriation of symbols and images from the Holocaust, where anti-vaxxer protesters place themselves in the position of being in the same position as inmates of Auschwitz, wearing the yellow star for that purpose, that to me is a crude and cruel assault on memory, on survivors, and not something that we have to acquiesce in silence. We have to call it out, we have to expose it, and we have to condemn it.
Thank you, Professor Cotler. The next question is about how in Canada can we address anti-Semitism that may come from other marginalized groups who they themselves may be targets of racism?
Well, I think that nobody should be exempt for accountability when it comes to racism of any kind. In other words, nobody gets a pass and should get a pass with regard to racism. I said this is a matter of common concern and common cause. If it comes from other communities who are anti-Semitic, I think the first responsibility is for those communities to call it out amongst their own community. Similarly, for example, if there was any anti-Black prejudice in and amongst Jews, then Jews should call it out. It shouldn't be left only to Blacks to call out anti-Black racism. It shouldn't be left only to Muslims to call out anti-Muslim racism and the like. I think these are matters of common concern. These are issues of the importance of allyship. These are issues where, in effect, racism, I mentioned anti-Semitism because of its historic toxicity, as Ahmed Shahid put it, as a threat to democratic values and democratic institutions, to democracy itself. I think racism is such a threat from whatever source, and therefore we each have a responsibility for what I would call zero tolerance re-racism, just as zero tolerance re-anti-Semitism, to call it out amongst our own as we call it out amongst others.
Thank you, Professor Cotler. Moving a little bit on to strategies on campus. So I have two questions from two attendees that I think are complementary and perhaps reflect some of the differences in opinion within the Jewish community around some of these issues. I have one question asking how you suggest faculty and students deal with the confounding issue of when people say, oh, I'm not being anti-Semitic, I'm just being anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, and how to navigate this. When you feel that someone is being anti-Semitic and they're hiding, you feel that they're hiding behind this claim to move themselves away from anti-Semitism. Versus, or maybe in complement to a question from another of our attendees, who says that as a Jew, to him or her, Judaism doesn't necessarily equal Zionism, or Zionism isn't a large part of their Judaism. And do you believe that anti-Semitism is happening because people think Jews automatically support Israel, and therefore is anti-Semitism because of Israel's actions against the Palestinians? So I'm bringing those two questions as two views from our audience that maybe you can help us put into balance.
Well, I always remember when I was a student at the time, when there was Jean-Paul Sartre's statement that if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would create him in her. I think it's the same today in the contemporary anti-Semitism, that, if Israel did not exist, the anti-Semite would create him. I don't think Jews, Zionists, or Israel should be blamed for anti-Semitism. I believe that, Israel, as I said, like any other state, should be called out for any violations of human rights. But that's been my whole point. Like any other state, we have to have equality before the law and under the law. We need to have equal protection and equal treatment of the law. And I think that equality rights lens works, I think, both with respect to classical anti-Semitism, as I mentioned in my remarks, as it does with respect to the new anti-Semitism. If in anti-Zionism finds expression in singling out one member state or people, which happens to be either the Jewish people or Israel, for selective opprobrium and indictment, as distinct from, legitimate criticism of Israel like any other state, then that has to be called out. It has to be called out because it's a standing violation of equal protection under the law and equal treatment under the law. Even here, with regard to the, IRA definition, where it sometimes is referred to as, that IRA definition suppresses speech. Well, it's the other way around. It's intended to protect speech. It's intended to protect the speech, for example, of Jews on campus who are being maligned or excluded or marginalized and the like in the campus culture. It's intended to protect the equality of students amongst others. And I think the other point with regard to the IRA working definition is that it makes it clear that criticism of Israel, like any other state, is not anti-Semitic. And in fact, what is less well known is that in February 2015, the House of Commons unanimously adopted a resolution. I remember it well. I was then a parliamentarian. I actually moved that resolution. And that resolution had three parts, which I think are particularly relevant and very quickly, and also contextualize the answer to the question. The first said, alarmed at the alarming rise in anti-Semitism. The second part was calls upon the Canadian government to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority in both our domestic and foreign policy. But then the third component, and that was the interesting one, said criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic, and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is hypocritical.
Thank you, Professor Cotler. So we are close to the end. We have two more questions that we'll ask. I'll ask the first one, which is actually a combination of several comments. So like many universities all over the world, U of T has not been immune to the global rise in anti-Semitism. What can be done on campus to bring more attention to this, and what strategies can be implemented? So really thinking about some of the concrete steps. And then a second question that's very specifically, I think, about raising about education. So if everyone in the community can quite easily recognize that Holocaust inversion, denialism, and vaccine comparisons are inappropriate, how can we regularly engage the community in learning about anti-Semitic rhetoric and actions that perhaps they're not successfully recognizing? So the first question about broader strategies, and a second about specific actions related to recognize that anti-Semitic rhetoric.
So I think with regard to the campus culture, education is crucial. I think this is something that is recognized in the University of Toronto report, which speaks to the importance of not having only education about the Holocaust, but education about anti-Semitism. If you educate only about the Holocaust in the framework of something that is historical, as if it has no relevance for our present times, then you end up in what Dara Horn in her book described as, talking about dead Jews, but not talking about the lived experience of what is happening in the campus culture today. So we need education, not only about the Holocaust across generations, but we need education about anti-Semitism. And I noticed, for example, that the U of T will be having a course, and I want to commend the Doctors Against Racism and Anti-Semitism for their initiatives in this regard, to have a course on medicine in the Holocaust. But again, it cannot be done just as a historical exercise. We have to learn the lessons, and one of the lessons that one learns from medicine and the Holocaust was what might be called the trahison d'éclair, the betrayal of the elites, that Nuremberg crimes were the crimes of Nuremberg elites, of scientists and doctors, of judges and lawyers, of church leaders and educators, of architects and engineers who were involved even in the construction of the death camp Auschwitz. In other words, we learned that we have to hold power, to not only speak truth to power, but hold power accountable to truth. So the Holocaust can't be taught only as a matter of history, but as a matter of contemporary applications, where we teach about the Holocaust as a paradigm of radical evil and learn the lessons of that for our time, and anti-Semitism as a paradigm of radical hate and learn the lessons of that to our time. And those lessons, for example, which are very relevant, is the dangers of silence in the face of evil. The 80th anniversary of the Wannsee Conference and the indifference and silence of the bystander community took us down, and we were already in at that time, the road to the Holocaust, as Christo noted. Again, in all these things, we have to teach the important lessons that have contemporary relevance. For example, the dangers of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity and genocide. That what makes the Holocaust and the genocide that followed, like in Rwanda, where 10,000 Tutsis were murdered every day for 3 months. What makes the Holocaust and the genocide in Rwanda so unspeakable were not only the horrors of the Holocaust and Rwanda themselves. What makes them so unspeakable is that they were preventable. Nobody can say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. Just as with regard to now, with regard to the Rohingya, or with regard to the Uyghurs, we know and we are not acting. And in that regard, I think what's important is that we have to, as I say, getting back to it, always call out anti-Semitism and hate, lest by our indifference and inaction, we become enablers and incentivizers. And so this is what I think we need to do in the campus culture. We need to educate about the Holocaust, educate about anti-Semitism, use Raoul Wallenberg as a role model, but understand, if I may say so, with regard to International Holocaust Remembrance Day, that this has to not only be a day of remembrance, which it is, but it has to be a day of remembrance to act on behalf of our common humanity. And if we are not acting, and if we are only studying it as a historical matter, then we will not be combating the contemporary evils that have to be combated by our individual and collective engagement in action.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and say that we are unfortunately not going to get to any other questions because it is 7:30. And I think those words that you just left us with, Professor Cotler, are really amazing ones for us to take away. As I think about the work that we're doing around equity and inclusion, diversity in the Temerity Faculty of Medicine, how do we learn, how do we address anti-Semitism, but how do we also see it as a way to learn from, as you've said, anti-Semitism as a paradigm of radical hate? How do we see that and learn from that, not only to stomp out anti-Semitism, but to work together to speak out against all forms of hate and discrimination and mistreatment in our environments, our learning environments, our working environments, and those experienced by our patients. So on behalf of Temerity Faculty of Medicine and our wonderful collaborators for this, thank you so much for your contributions, both to the work that you're doing around the world, but also for sharing this time with us tonight and for all of your teachings. We're very appreciative. Thank you to everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.